Your brand may be staying on top of current trends, but are you agile enough to stay relevant, resilient, and successful as customers, competition, and the world continues to change at a breakneck pace? I'm thrilled to share the newly revised version of my first book, The Agile Brand. I'm calling it The Agile Brand Revisited. It's been updated to reflect our continually changing world, and it provides 7 principles that form the backbone of an agile brand, offering detailed insights and actionable steps for incorporating them into your business strategy. This is the book that started it all, and I'm excited to share it with you. It's now available in print and digital formats and available everywhere. Learn more by going to the Agile Brand Guide website at www.agilebrandguide.com. Welcome to Season 4 of The Agile Brand with Greg Kihlstrom, where we discuss business agility through customer experience, employee experience, and digital transformation. I'm your host, Greg Kihlstrom. The Agile World podcast is brought to you by TEKsystems, an industry leader in full-stack technology services, talent services, and real-world application. For more information, go to teksystems.com. To read more about the topics discussed on this show, you can go to my website at gregkihlstrom.com and read my latest articles or get a copy of my latest book, Meaningful Measurement of the Customer Experience, now available on Amazon and other retailers. My name is Greg Kihlstrom, and I'm the host of the Agile World podcast. Today we're going to talk about agility in our systems of measurement and how we approach meaningful change in customer experience in an organization. To help me discuss this topic, I'd like to welcome Desirree Madison-Biggs, Head of the U.S. Advisory Services at Teresa Monroe. Desirree, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Greg. It's great to be here with you.
Yeah, looking forward to talking with you. So, first of all, I think the way that you came into the profession of customer experience is really interesting. So why don't you share for the audience, give them a sense of your background, where you started in your career, and how you got into a more formal role in CX?
Sure. It's a story that I love to tell, and I guess I would start out by describing myself by a new term that I just got exposed to, a passionista.
Nice.
And a passionista is somebody who follows their passion and creates a career out of that. And so I would say my trajectory or my journey has been quite diverse. I started out as a social worker with juvenile delinquent boys, as a matter of fact, which I think made me distinctly ready to deal with the corporate world. From there, I moved into human resources, where I spent 7 years supporting a big multinational corporation. And then I decided at some point that I really wanted to understand the customer better. And so I went to a startup company, one of the first internet service providers in the country that was serving consumers before it was even a thing. And from there, I learned a lot about technology. I learned a lot about selling. And I learned a lot about customer satisfaction and what happens to sales when customer satisfaction is not so great. And I kept thinking about how you create better experiences, because if you want to have profitability, if you want to have good revenue and all those things that are beneficial to the whole company, you've got to have an approach that is holistic, and you've got to fix things that are broken. And lots of things break along the way, especially if you're making things up as you go. So I found myself eventually in a director role of a sales organization, and I created a customer satisfaction role. And that person was responsible for doing interviews with the new customers that came on board. And so from there, I found that so useful. I got into business process improvement for a short time after I left the sales world, and found out from an operational perspective what it takes to fix things. And I think right about that time was when customer experience was beginning to take a form that was new and kind of a fresh approach, and new metrics were being measured and utilized and experimented with, NPS being right there. So I knew Fred Reichheld, and we were a Satmetrics customer at that time, and they were the co-creators of it. So I was able to put some experiments into place, and I took a role on which was completely dedicated, at that time it was called customer satisfaction and loyalty. So I was responsible for getting all the metrics in place and driving voice of customer adoption within the company, and just kind of made it up from there.
Great. Well, yeah, let's dive in then and talk a little bit more about measurement and customer experience. And so you just mentioned your involvement and usage of Net Promoter Score. Earlier in your career, you were using Customer Loyalty Index, and then you switched to NPS. Can you talk a little bit about that process, and what was the decision, or the some of the guiding ideas behind switching?
I think if I were going to bottom line it, it all has to do with actionability. And while the customer loyalty index was useful in creating a metric where everybody played a part, it was less obvious who was responsible for what. And so that created a lot of either distance in the organization from the metric, or it created a lot of distance between each of the organizations. And it
Yeah,
was hard to bring people together to decide what was going to be fixed and what was most important to be fixed and what was really the impact overall. So, what you got the CLI, what does it really mean?
right,
And
right.
so, when the research for Net Promoter came out, um, it was like, well, duh. It's all about, do your customers love you or not?
Right,
And
right.
what was the science behind it? And I know, after 20 years, there's been lots of pot shots taken at it and lots of people have poo-pooed it, but more have found it to be a pretty vibrant outcome metric. And that's what we
Yeah,
found it to be too.
yeah. And so I'm certainly, I have thoughts on NPS, and I think it's valuable in a number of different ways. But there's also other measurements as well that kind of augment NPS, and I think NPS can be a great relative baseline. In some instances, to just see, if you have years and years of this same measurement, it's incredibly valuable to be able to see things fluctuate and everything like that. What would you say to an organization that they may be using something like NPS or CSAT or CES or other things, or maybe sometimes all of the above,
Hmm.
but they kind of feel like they're not, they need more. Can an organization kind of be stuck in looking at things through a single lens? And how would you recommend that they experiment with new ways of measuring while not giving up the important legacy stuff like an NPS?
Yeah, you've actually raised a couple of really good points. Um, I think the most important thing is understanding the difference between KPIs and outcome metrics.
Hmm.
And then within your outcome metrics, being really clear on what drives them and building that scaffolding towards that outcome, which is, which customers love you and why. And so if you can do that by understanding your organizational and cultural metrics, right? So your employee metrics, which are foundational, and then you have your operational metrics and like how is your operations actually performing relative to whatever standards are appropriate. And then, how do your top line metrics like customer preference, purchase intent, and all of those kinds of things, how do those show up? And then finally, how do they display themselves in outcome metrics? And one of the things that I have seen is that, well, I've seen a lot of things, but one of them is that NPS gets overused and it gets put into like process metrics and it gets put like you NPS
Yeah,
everything.
yeah,
And it's a measure of relationship. And if you're not measuring a relationship, you shouldn't be using NPS. You should use transactional relationships, and transactional scores and metrics. And you can do a transactional NPS, but it's slightly different. It doesn't adhere to the principles of the overall NPS. But the main thing is you have to be able to track the correlation and the causations of why your metrics are moving. And if you can build that with the help of key folks within the organization, because it's definitely a game that you play with the whole team, then you have a chance of really driving systemic change and changing your NPS score and other outcome metrics that you're measuring in a meaningful way.
do you think we'll ever move past NPS, or is it not really, is that not really the right question to ask? Is it more about augmenting NPS with other things?
I think that's a really good question. I think people like new and exciting things.
Yeah.
And I guess if you could come up with a question and the supporting statistical relevance of that question to outcomes and behaviors that are equal to or better than NPS, that could win the day. But after 20 years, NPS still is a shining star in the ability not only to measure things, but to motivate people, um, to help them to understand what creates somebody who is an advocate or a promoter of your brand. I mean, like, that's the holy grail for a marketing organization. It's like, okay, well, if our NPS is here, what's reasonable? What are our competitors doing? And then what do we need to do to get better? And does the organization understand what those things are? And do we have the mechanisms in place to capture that and to drive those changes? You know, like, what are your closed loop performance metrics and your processes, right? To your inner loop, right? The individual, how do you action the feedback that you're getting and how do you communicate about those actions? And then you have your learnings from the treasure that you're given by your customers to deliver to the rest of the organization, whether it's your product group, whether it's your support organization, and then what do they do with that information? And then how, the trickiest part, Greg, this will probably sound familiar, is that there are other competing metrics within the organization, and you get
Yeah.
people from different persuasions that will take pot shots at any metric or not take responsibility, or they have a listening post or a channel for feedback that they just prefer.
Right.
And so then it
Right.
becomes um, the way that I've seen that resolved and have helped to resolve that is to show that the customers are saying the same things. They're just saying it at a different level. And sometimes it's more actionable than others, right? And so being able to tell the stories behind your customer measurements and those metrics that show, that's the art of being in the customer experience world.
Talking about there's some organizations that kind of they use NPS as I'm picking on NPS, but just because we're talking
Sure.
about it, but they use NPS as really their sole CX metric, and
Mhm.
there's certainly other things involved and certainly other things that they watch, but one sometimes feels like too few, but how do you know when you're measuring too much? Because there is also the if you have 20 KPIs and metrics and things that you're paying attention to, how can you really know if you've succeeded if you've got 20 different things that you're trying to pay attention to? So
Yep.
what's your without obviously numbers and amounts may vary based on the size of the org and different things like that, but how do you know when it's too much, maybe is the question there.
Yes, and I think too much and the right thing
Right.
is the other aspect of that. And so the way that I think about it is that if NPS is your relationship metric, then putting together a relationship survey and the analytics behind it to understand what really is correlated to customer loyalty is the most important thing. And from there, you can start to tease it apart and to understand what performance metrics within the organization, whether it's operational, whether it's financial, even employee, which one of those correlate to NPS. And then each group understands their line of sight to NPS, right? So if it's the overall satisfaction with the product, or if it's um, overall satisfaction with support, like, where do those line up and what drives that level of satisfaction within those operations? And so everybody should understand how their frontline metrics or their organizational metrics or whatever ladder up to that NPS. And once you are able to do that, and it does take a while, by the way, to get that all right. And I would advise any company to put the resources behind really solid analytics so that you can do the work. Otherwise, you're right. You're just going to end up with this floaty metric out there that really people go, oh, wow, our NPS went up, or oh, how sad, it went down.
Yeah.
But if you can't tell a story about why and watch what's happening in the market and the influence on customers' brand perception. If you can't understand when you're understaffed in your support organization and all of your numbers go down, and then you watch NPS go down, 3 months or a month later,
Right.
if you can't tell that story, then you're going to get tripped up and you're not going to be very successful.
Yeah, I really like that because I often talk about when you're building a customer centric culture, everyone should be able to have a line of sight to the customer from whatever, wherever they sit basically in the org,
Hmm.
even if they don't feel like they have a relationship with the customer or their work doesn't relate to that. So I like that you're adding that adds a quantifiable component to that. It's not just a feeling and a motivation, which are also important, but it actually adds something quantifiable, which also appeals to the statistician in me, I guess.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about the impact of the pandemic. I mean, we're, as of recording this, we're 18 plus months into the pandemic. Impact of that on business, and what does it mean from a CX perspective, and what's changing, and maybe what's not changing. So, what do we need to be thinking about from a customer perspective as we begin to, fingers crossed, like as we approach a post-pandemic state of being?
So the phrase that comes to mind when you ask that question is that the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Yeah.
And I think about customer experience and where and its rich heritage and legacy from which it came, which is business process improvement and all of the efforts that were going on in the 80s and 90s for companies to deliver excellence. And so if we think about that, we have this rich heritage of change management and operational measurement and outcome metrics and everything. And we're really standing on the shoulders of giants with that. And so if I think about where we need to be going now and thinking about the pandemic, I don't think, in some ways, everything's changed, but nothing's changed.
Yeah.
What I think has happened is we have gotten clarity on things that were a little fuzzy in the past. And even though the value chain between the employee experience and customer loyalty has been talked about for decades, I don't think it's ever been more clear where the focus needs to be. And I remember, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, we were experimenting with understanding the correlation between employee engagement and customer
Yeah.
loyalty, right? And now I'm seeing in this space, that's what everybody is talking about. And I think some of the drivers of the adoption have definitely been the pandemic, but even before that and during, it's been technology and the ability to do so much more at a lower cost and being able to understand really what's happening, the voice of the organization, the voice of the customer, and the voice of the employee, and to be able to put them together in powerful ways that tell a story that really make people stand up and take notice.
One last question to look at that, I guess, from the inverse angle, maybe the internal angle. Um, we're they're calling it the Great Resignation. The return to the office has been, in some cases, indefinitely delayed, or at least a very slow roll to get back in, and stuff like that. What advice would you have for organizations that, some still haven't even figured out their true return to the office plan? Others are again, delayed or rethinking even. How do you maintain great CX while there's this kind of turmoil and turnover and uncertainty and stuff like that continuing?
I have so much empathy for the leadership of companies that are wrestling with how to do their businesses now. What I'm excited about is that some of the um, desires of employees to work remotely, to be able to have a better life harmony instead of balance, right? Because balance is kind of a strange thing when you're trying to do 50 million things at once,
Right, right.
but to have some kind of personal and work harmony. Um, so now leadership is being forced to deal with this in a way that they could have punted for years.
Right. Fair
Right?
enough. Yeah.
So I think that it is just a tremendous opportunities for brands to reinvent themselves around the customer experience and employee experience. And I would guess, I haven't seen research per se, I'm sure it's out there, but the companies that are doing it the best, where employees are the happiest, are actually haven't seen a decline in their customer experience at all. They've actually maybe even seen a more positive. incline in their
Yeah.
measurements. And so it's really back to that, what um, changes stays the same. It's like it's about the human experience, and it's really about service. Like, how do I, in human resources, serve the product organization such that they can be successful? How do I, in the product group, um, develop in a way that the support organization can be successful and not cost, the business its bottom line because they're always trying to
Yeah.
fix everything, right?
Right.
Like, how do we come together as human beings serving other human beings and make the world a better place?
Yeah, and I do think that to take the optimistic and positive standpoint on the the last year and a half or so is, I think we've all, or at least most people, have learned a bit of empathy for others and their situations, and so I think even the customers are more empathetic to those employees. And that doesn't mean customers are still, I think they're expecting better experience and more personalization and more of everything and quicker and everything. But at the same time, there's a bit of empathy for companies that treat their employees well. I mean, I think there was that already. There was kind of shifts towards even paying attention to how a company treats their employees a bit more. I see that increasing as well. Would you agree?
Yeah, definitely. And as you were talking, I was thinking about some experiences that I've had as a customer recently, which has highlighted one of my concerns, several of my concerns, but this is a big one, and that is that we allow technology and automation to supplant the human experience, such that it actually creates more friction than it does resolution. And the sense of anonymity that comes with some artificial intelligence implementations is just horrible, and it's isolating, and it absolutely will divorce you from your customer base, particularly when things go awry. And we all know that we create policies, we do hiring, we do all these things that help create a business, and it doesn't always work that great, right? And it's
Right.
constantly you're trying to catch up, or you're trying to be better, etc. But if you don't have accurate measurements that help you to understand where your automation is working well for your customers' relationships or not, that is going to be the one that trips you up, probably more so than anything else, because customers will leave you and you'll never know until you see your leaky bucket so full of holes it'll look like Swiss cheese.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that you also brought it back to measurement. That's a great way to come full circle here. Well, Desiree, thanks so much for joining the show. I really enjoyed talking with you here. For those listening, what's the best way for them to keep up with what you're doing?
Well, you can see me on LinkedIn and my hashtag is, well, that's not really my hashtag, but it's Feedback Diva, or it's Desirree Madison-Biggs. That's where I do a lot of my posting. And you'll also see me working with a whole lot of different customers out there. Greg, thanks so much for having me here.
Wonderful. Yeah, absolutely. Well, again, I'd like to thank Desirree Madison-Biggs, Head of U.S. Advisory Services at Teresa Monroe, for joining the show. Thanks again for listening to the Agile Brand with Greg Kihlstrom podcast, brought to you by Tech Systems. If you enjoyed the show, please take a minute to subscribe on your podcast channel of choice and leave us a rating so that others can find the show more easily. You can access more episodes of the show at www.theagilebrand.show. To get a copy of my latest book, Meaningful Measurement of the Customer Experience, visit my website at gregkihlstrom.com. Until next week, stay agile.